So first of all, I guess the one thing we should talk about is any tips on how to read this.
I've read it at least 5 times, like front to back. And I'm still learning, you know, every time I read it, I'm still learning something new, noticing something new, or understanding something differently. So I think for this piece, it's best to try to identify some keywords that she's defining over and over again, or providing different parts of the definition throughout, and trying to focus on those, because it's a thick text. So
All right. I don't know. Let's go through some of the arguments that she's making. Right. We'll start there. So I think, or what's really helpful for me to do with this piece is kind of like visualize it, right? So like, what's her starting point and how does she move through? So it's obvious that she starts off, I mean, I don't know if starting off is the right word, but
yeah, jumps in.
right? Jumps off with the Moynihan report. I can't even say it.
Yeah.
Which was a study about the family unit, the Black family unit, and
Yeah.
she critiquing that.
Yeah, actually, I would say even earlier in just those first couple sentences.
The sapphire, peaches, brown sugar.
Yeah. As when I read that, I immediately think of Melissa Harris Perry's book, Sister Citizen, where she goes through these stereotypes and talks about their history and like what they've meant for Black women. So, but I think that those first couple sentences are so important because we're immediately talking about women. You don't necessarily know that from the title. Yeah, so I think, I don't want to say most important. Every single word she uses is important here. But I am a marked woman, and my country needs me, and if I were not here, I would have to be invented. So I think those two parts of that section are like, they're really key to this text. Right off the bat, it's something that if you want to understand the text, you're going to have to decide what that means, figure out what that means. And I mean, marking is such a huge part of this text. So she's using that throughout, and with hieroglyphics and ungendering and flesh and body. I mean, this is all about, it's very much about marking, which is super important for education, I would think. Marking, like, you know, like marks. we literally mark students. So
all right, so keywords that I've heard is hieroglyphics of the flesh, marking, although I mean she does use the word marking, but maybe not as, maybe we won't think about it necessarily as like the top theoretical, but I agree it should be in there. Ungendering was the other okay, so we start off with these names, then we move to the report, right?
Yes, and the report is fascinating. It's really easy to read.
What do you think, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what is the beef with the report?
So the report, it's really interesting. I think it's if you're interested in talking about like colorblind or multicultural liberalism, it's a really it's a really good starting point of that, because it's like the intent of the report is good, right? Like the intent is President Johnson saying there's inequality in this country and we need to figure out why. And so I think it's so interesting of like this is really why impact matters more than intent, because the impact of this report is so heavy for social theory and social policy, and so the impact was huge. The intent was good, but the impact was wholly negative. So basically Moynihan, he researched why there was such vast inequality in the country still. Like we've, along the progress narrative, there's been so much progress made. Why are Black people still statistically having such a difficult time? And so he decides that it's because of the family structure. The Black family structure is to blame. And he's saying that the Black family structure is white people's fault. But in saying that, it doesn't negate the fact that he's, well, as Spiller says, or reiterates, that he's calling it a tangle of pathology. So he's pathologizing the Black family. It doesn't end up really mattering that he's saying this is white America's fault, because it's still the same result, right? We're just saying that there's something wrong with Black people, and it's next to impossible to solve.
One of the things that really resonates with me about this piece, or that has always been, like, I get goosebumps, right, is just her ability to connect all of this to slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And like do that genealogy. And so I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about that connection, right? Like, because I think there's the family structure, right? And then there's ideas of gendered, right? That she's hashing out. That is not just like, it has specific connotations for women, right? And she goes there. But I think underneath it too, there's like very big connotations and meanings for masculinity as well. So maybe you can help us understand, right, that connection to slavery a little bit, and then from there, I guess the next thing, and you tell me if you agree with this, could be like this whole thing about the flesh and then the ungendering.
Mm-hmm. So the Moynihan report helps her connect it back to slavery, because Moynihan himself is saying that the problem with the Black family is that they were constantly being torn apart during slavery, and that this has made the Black familial structure, the nuclear family, this has been repeated through generations, so that now there's basically Black people don't have a sense of a nuclear family. They have these kinship ties that we're going to disregard because we value the nuclear family over kinship, which that alone says a lot about gender. So so she's kind of taking that, taking his word for it, and looking at that and saying, great, let's talk about slavery, and so she goes back to the mother, and this is actually probably one of my favorite parts of the piece, is the conversation she's having about mothering, and this is really important to youth too, because she's saying that basically enslaved women weren't allowed to mother. There was a law that came from, I believe, England, that said that which comes from the womb I'd rather just read her words. I'm just going to pull it up.
Yeah, I'm excited that you're bringing this because, just having my engagements with your work, like this is a big piece of what you've been thinking about, right?
Yeah.
So tell us, enlighten us.
This is my favorite part of the piece. So this is on page 79, and maybe I'll just read this whole part. If we can account for an originary narrative and judicial principle that might have engendered a Moynihan report many years into the 20th century, we cannot do much better than look at Goodell's reading of the Partus Sequitur Ventrum. The condition of the slave mother is, quote, forever entailed on all her remotest posterity, end quote. This maxim of civil law, in Goodell's view, the, quote, genuine and degrading principle of slavery, inasmuch as it places the slave upon a level with brute animals, prevails universally in the slaveholding states, end quote. But what is the, quote unquote, condition of the mother? Is it the, quote unquote, condition of enslavement the writer means? Or does he mean the, quote unquote, mark and the, quote unquote, knowledge of the mother upon the child that here translates into the culturally forbidden and impure? And then she incorporates a conversation about Frederick Douglass that I also think is really interesting. But so Partus Sequitur Ventrum is fascinating because it's saying that children belong to the slaveholder. So I think about that as in terms of I want to say like the unmothering, like the way she talks about ungendering. And this is why she's pointing to it. She's saying that this law is really what we can look back to as starting to tear apart the family, because she's not interested in like reifying the nuclear family.
No.
She's like, that's well and good. I mean, whether we have a nuclear family or not doesn't, that doesn't make or break the Black family. But she is saying mothering is important, which is a completely different way to look at what family means, what kinship means.
And can you tell us what that means for the idea of gender, of what gender is? If that makes any sense.
What the law, the Partus Sequitur Ventrum?
Right. And the unmothering, right? And then, because I think part of the reason why I wanted to start with this, right? Mm-hmm. It's because what dominates conversations, at least in education, right? And in intro courses of gender, oftentimes is the discussion between the biological construction of gender and then the social construction of gender. Mm-hmm. And I think what's so refreshing about starting with Spillers and starting with Blackness, right, and Black feminism is that many are not necessarily having large stakes in that, right? They're thinking differently about this, right? And one of the things that I hear Spiller saying is drawing perhaps not as explicit, but a connection between the idea of the mother, right, and what it constitutes to be a woman, right? And that these ideas then have big repercussions and have historically outlined the experiences of Black folks, right? That then bleeds out into like an idea of difference, right? And like subjectivity, right? And who's constituted as disturbing and who's constituted as not disturbing. Mm-hmm. So I'm just trying to poke to see what you think perhaps is a linkage there between the way and she's thinking about, like a more explicit linkage between what she's thinking about the family, mothering, and then gender. If that makes sense. sense.
Yes, definitely. Okay, so in geography,
I just saw your hair. You're like, I got this. Come on.
yeah, you explained it really well. I know where I'm going now.
Yeah, tell us.
So in geography, there's this term in unvisibility, and I don't want to say it's more of a Black studies term than I would say a geography term, and it's talked about in The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. So unvisibility means that a Black subject is invisible due to their highly visible bodily context. So I think this is what she's relating here between mothering and so the partus sequitur ventrum. It invisibilizes the relationship between the mother and the child, um, because we're still thinking about children and the mother as property. So it's taking away that mothering relationship, making it invisible. But because property is highly visible, the elements of these subjects become hyper visible. So we see that if we go back to the first part of the essay, where she's listing all of these names and saying, I am a marked woman. And this is really we think of stereotypes as being like really so banal, like they're just, we say them all the time, that they become normal, right? So it invisibilizes them because they're no longer surprising or exciting, or it's just part of everything. So for instance, like Sapphire or the angry Black woman or the mammy, they're just right, it's a syrup bottle, like it's just part of of our culture and society. So that's the invisibilizing. The hyper visibilizing then is when that the punishment that comes with that. So in the school context, we think about Black students having higher rates of suspension, expulsion. We think about Black students as being reported as disruptive more often than white students, despite similar behaviors. And so that's the hyper visibility. So it's a really difficult combination of the two, right? That these things are happening simultaneously, that a relationship between the mother and child is invisibilized, but then also by pathologizing it, right, it becomes hyper visible. We don't see the Black family because it's basically outside of our society, but there's something wrong with it. So when we are talking about it, it's in a negative context. And the same with gender. So we have gender, anything between, there's either male or female, right? The gender is girl or boy. Anything beyond that, we can't see. It can exist. But then when it's around, we're going to pathologize it, point it out because there's something wrong with it.
Which I think one of the things that you're making me think about is just, I'm thinking about, just the fact that 82% of the teacher workforce are white females, right? And a lot of the classical argument about teacher education oftentimes is about what it means to care for your students, right? And the responsibilities that you have for that love for your students, right? And so then what does it mean? Now I'm thinking like, what does it mean to have these motherly ideas of a teacher, right? Who most likely will be a white woman, right, in the classroom with Black students. Just something I'm thinking about now.
Yeah, that's I think that's the interesting thing about that is when you go into these situations with that kind of attitude, it's premised on the assumption that they're not receiving proper mothering. So it's already assuming that you're going into a situation where there's something wrong, that you're there to help.
Right, that you're there to fix something.
Mm-hmm. That you're there to give something that they don't have access to, that they couldn't possibly have access to.
Right. Is this the section where she talks about, I'm trying to remember now. Is this where she starts talking about ungendering and hieroglyphics of the flesh? Oh no, this is the end. I bet.
This is the end. I always forget it's so far down.
Yeah, it's section 3. Because there's 3 sections, right? Mm-hmm. I'm like, always with this one, for some reason, I think a lot about winter and unsettling coloniality. And I'm like, where in the book are we? Both of them are not books, but in my head, they're books.
Right. They say a lot more than a lot of books, so.
That's true. So she here, so tell us a little bit more about what you think she's doing with the body. Because a lot about this is too, right? I mean, I read it as she's also talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of trouble with the body and flesh distinction. I still am like barely touching it. I'm definitely not grasping it. I'm more like brushing up against it, reaching out as it runs away. But I think what's important, and one thing that I actually talk about in my work is what Fanon calls epidermalization, right? So that's the assigning phenotypical
characteristics.
Characteristics to a race. So you're Black because you look Black, right? That's so that's the marking, or it has a lot to do with the marking that she's talking about. And the reason that she's saying that she's marked, so not that she's born with this mark, but she was given this mark, right? Because color means nothing until we assign something to it. So yes, we were born Black, but Black doesn't exist unless we give it that name. So that's what the marking is. And then it's different from naming, which she also talks about, which is so important, which is more of like, I am Black, I am capital B Black. That's my naming versus the mark that I've been given.
Right. So then what's the whole deal with this whole engendering thing that she's talking about?
Yeah, well, so.
Because I think for me, it goes back to the idea of property.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm. This is so complicated.
It is complicated. They're going to be watching this and they're going to be like,
yeah. So the ungendering is they're in the white construction, right? The white heteronormative social construction. There is a dominant male and a submissive, gentle, I don't know, woman, female. um, on the plantation, there is no room for femininity, right? It's all about work. It's all about labor. It's all about production. In the enslaved women's cases, it's about reproduction, as part of the labor assignment. And so there is none of the femininity that's granted to white women. I mean, it's also expected, it's also problematic, but there's not even any option for that, right, on the plantation. So that's part of the ungendering, right? Taking away anything that distinguishes the female slave from the male slave. And also with that comes interesting, like there's an interesting link to that between the labor and rape and violence against women on the plantation that then has extended into life today, right? So
I'm glad you're going there, because that was going to be my next question about, I think a lot of, we're getting into this whole different conversation, but for me, like one of the Saadia Hartman's book, Scenes of Subjection, was one of those like life-changing books for me that has allowed me to make some sort of sense of what we're seeing. So I interrupted you, but all of this to say that I'm glad you're heading there, because I wanted to know how this is helping you make sense of what we're seeing now too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about this a lot with trans women, trans Black women, and trans men too. But with Black trans women, so I mean, they're a lot more visible now because of a lot of work. Like I don't want to say it's just popular media, but because it's been a long time of them pushing for this visibility. And actually, I think Pose demonstrates that really well, like how excited they are, right, that voguing is popular and they know how to do it and they can share that with other people. Like I think that was a really masterful way to explain how much work has been put in by the Black trans community in becoming more visible. And but I see the ungendering also, so it has a lot to do, as I was saying, with Black femininity and taking away that Black femininity, but then it also has this impact on masculinity as well. So because now there's no protection. The Black man can't offer any protection for his family, right? It doesn't matter if he was married, if he jumped the broom with a woman, she is still property, right? And she can be taken by the slave owner at any and whenever he feels like it. So there's also this huge impact on Black masculinity, which is, I struggle with this argument because there's no excuse for violence against Black women and Black trans people, but this is a lot of where that comes from, of this ungendering of all Black people, not just Black women. And because at the same time it's a paradox of being told that you have no protection to give your family, and then also that a man protects his family.
Right.
So that's what I think that's
through the idea of the master.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
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 Well, that's the part that I work with a lot when I on my work about Black youth, is that they're told that Blackness is pathological, and because it's biological, it's inescapable, right? There is no getting beyond your Blackness. Your Blackness is a sickness that will be with you forever. There's nothing you can do about it. And at the same time, having this American ideal of individuation where it's pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get your life together, it's an impossible paradox, right? You can't escape the situation you're in, but you're expected to escape the situation that you're in.
Right. I don't know, do you have any other important thoughts that you think are like must hits with this piece?
I'm trying to think if there's any other way I could tie it to school. The Moynihan Report in a lot of ways. So that's the first thing that I talk about in my literature review theory section is the Moynihan Report and the tangle of pathology and what that means for Black youth specifically. Because when he uses the term tangle of pathology, he's specifically talking about Black youth, that they're being brought up in this tangle of pathology. And so, like I said, I make that point that the Moynihan Report is really laying out this impossible situation for Black youth where they're told that there's no escaping race, and race is inevitable and biological, and also that they need to still meet American ideals. So what I look at for that is the impact on identity, but I'm specifically looking at comprehensive racial learning, which actually comes from education. It comes from Erin Winkler, and she has this really great book, Learning Place, Learning Race.
What?
It's yeah. So I really like this term that she works with, and so what it says is that we, of course, we learn race from everywhere we are. You know, even if a space isn't quote unquote about race, there are still discourses of race to be discovered, and that it also centers youth as agents in that process. So it's not just she argues that socialization says that all these things are coming at youth, and they that knowledge comes is directed at youth, and then they just go with the flow, right? That there's no actually like engagement with what is going on around them or the discourses that they're hearing. So, but comprehensive racial learning, on the other hand, centers the youth as agentic, saying that no, they're actually thinking about this a lot. They're actually trying to understand these contradictions and trying to decide basically, you know, like what their identity is, who's their group, who's their people, right? So I think this is so interesting because of, I spend the first section of my paper talking about 4 girls in one of the organizations that I work with that identified as Black and. So the group is 4 Black girls, but they don't, the application says Black girls and girls of color. So they really don't discriminate between any girl of color who wants to apply, but it's very much a Black-centered program. And so these girls come in identifying as Black and one's Black and Mexican, one's Black and Mexican and Portuguese, and one is Black and Indian. And then one girl says, I'm not gonna identify as anything because anytime I tell people, who I am, they make all these assumptions about me. And so I just say, I'm me. So I talk about that, and I talk about what it means for these girls to have also been brought up in these situations where they're experiencing a lot of blackness, anti-blackness within their families. And so that complicates, right, their comprehensive racial learning, because we think of the family as being the place where you have the most support and affirmations, right? A lot of times we think about that. And then in the case of these girls who are Black, and they're actually having to grapple a lot with the people, their closest kin, who are saying disparaging things about their identity. So the way that I understand how the positive impact of the organizations that I work with is through a radical Black feminist frame of valuing intersections of identity, valuing effective responses, and valuing collectivity. And so these are also things that Spillers is talking about. Specifically, she's talking a lot about the collectivity, right? And we think about that with kinship networks, of that we formulate our racial identity in conversation with these extended kinship networks, and that this organization becomes one of these places that they're really encouraged to grapple with these ideas and really critique this idea of pathological Blackness and American meritocracy, right?
Right. Yeah, I don't think I get any more questions. So let's just go down your top. I was gonna say 3, but let's do 5 just because it's so dense. Like your top 5 keywords. And then my last question is, this one might be a hard question, so let me know if you're just like, fuck, I don't even know. If you were to give like a soundtrack to this piece.
I saw this question and I was like, that is the hardest question I've ever been asked in my life. Next.
I've been thinking about it a lot. One song.
Or that was so hard.
I don't know. If you had to draw this, I'm trying to visualize this. Yeah, so let's do like the 5 keywords. And then if you got any album cover or anything, or any art piece, jewelry, I don't care, an outfit.
Okay, keywords, tangle pathology, hieroglyphics of the flesh, body and flesh, if those can be different ones. Naming is really important. So naming and marking. And ungendering.
Cool. All right, and then if you got any artsy, creative, non-academic thing that you can help associate with this, what would it be? Like a dish, a plate, a soda, an alcohol drink.
Yeah, it would be something that,
a flavor.
You wake up on the next day in the middle of, specifically in the middle of the woods.
It's a tough one, right? I've been thinking about it. I also like I can't find a song that fits.
There's like, no offense to songwriters. There's of course really great music, but none of them. I don't know if any of them can work with this. Like, um, I think about. I really like, if I close my eyes, I think this is a good one too. Like, if you close your eyes and visualize, think about the article and like what comes into your mind. I see um, a naked Black woman standing um, on a plantation with like a slave ship in the background, like off in the distance. And and there's like, I don't know if you can see them, but you hear or sense that there's children nearby. I think that that's what I visualize. Circular.
Well, that's it, yo. This was way more than I could have asked for. So thank you so much. Yeah.